In a city that measures worth by pedigree and price tags, Myra, a humble delivery woman with calloused fingers and a battered violin, is plucked from an alley and forced to perform at a glittering conservatory gala. The violin is cracked, its varnish scarred, its bridge bowed like a prayer. The audience expects a novelty, a quaint interlude. But Myra's first note spills from the instrument like a confession and silences the room. It reconnects people to memory, shame, and longing. As rivalries unravel and past sins surface, music becomes judge and healer. The story follows Myra's sudden rise, the brittle pride of a famed patron named Anton who orchestrates her exhibition, the young virtuoso Elias whose world tilts, and an old luthier, Rosa, who recognizes the instrument's soul. Through emotional reckonings, ambition colliding with redemption, greed confronted by grace, the broken violin reveals who is truly broken and who can still be mended. The rain started in thin threads that turned to a steady knitting, a sound Myra understood in her bones. It was a city that took vows against the weather, the sort of place where people wrapped themselves in umbrellas as if they could fold the sky into obedience. Myra crossed the market square with a crate of pastries balanced against a hip and the violin case clamped between knees and elbow. The case was cheap leather, threaded at the seams with years of bus rides and back-alley rehearsals. The violin inside had once been a man's devotion. She moved with the efficiency of the small and used, no pause where there could be a step, eyes scanning for shortcuts, for faces that would try to take something at a glance. On her back was a faint ache that had become companion, shoulders tense, ribs used to the shape of work. Her fingers still smelled of flour. She liked that the smell stayed. It told her she had not been swaddled into some other life by mistake. She had chosen this meager one, and it allowed her the nights when the city hummed under her open panes and the violin leaned against the chair like a tired companion. She'd learned to play by copying the itinerant musicians who gathered beneath the motorway bridge at dusk. They played for coins and cigarettes and the occasional sandwich. She studied their hands as if they'd left footnotes in some sacred text, how the thumb anchored the neck, how the bow's hair sighed against the string. The violin she carried had been given to her by a man whom she had never called father, but whose name had been Elias, the same name as the conservatory's star son. He had left the instrument with her in a grocery alley, wrapped in oilcloth and smelling faintly of pipe smoke, with a whispered instruction, "Keep it talking." She never found him again. The instrument was a repository of grief and small triumphs. On the morning of the gala, she didn't know that the city would hand her to a different kind of hunger. She delivered a box of eclairs to a side door of the Aurelius Conservatory, a place she had seen from the bus window like a place in a painting, marble lions, columns carved with musical motifs, windows glinting with history as if the building itself were in rehearsal. The gala was for donors who polished their names into plaques, and for an audience that had learned to swallow the uncomfortable things money played for them. Her regular route took her past the conservatory every week. The cafe next door supplied the staff. She'd once sold a pocketful of wildflowers to a cloakroom attendant. But this morning, the door opened and a hand, long-fingered, gloved, stopped her in the threshold. "We're short a performer," the voice said, crisp, amused. A woman in a cowl of sable and a face like a ledger of transactions. She smelled faintly of citrus and cold metal. "Come in." Myra hesitated because her legs said stay, because the rain said go back where the boxes were lined up like quick graves of pastries that would never be eaten. Then a loafer tapped the step, and beside it a pair of polished shoes moved with a decision that told her to follow. Maybe it was a gust of curiosity. Maybe it was how the violin hummed at the touch of her shoulder. Inside, the conservatory breathed differently. Chandeliers like inverted gardens, red velvet, a hum of human wealth that seemed to keep itself polished with the smallest of lies. Mirrors multiplied the guests. Gold whistles and cameo necklaces blinked under the lights. Someone poured something fizzy into crystal. Someone else laughed like a bell. Myra clutched her case and thought of the bridge under which she had played when no one would listen, and how her first real audience had been a dog that tilted its head and then left. "She can play," said the attendant with the ledger face. She had the manner of someone who measured risk like a ledger, the odds, the return, then moved on. A charming anecdote. A novelty. Send her on. The orchestra needs a palate cleanser. The orchestra, led by Anton Aurelius, was a household name. He was the conservatory's patron, the man with portraits that exhaled corporate power. a man who had built the name by buying reputations and then renting them back to the city at a profit. He moved like a man kept inside a carved chair. He believed in the economy of gestures. A slight drop of his eyelid could rearrange a career. He had invited the city's most polished faces to his gala, and now turned his attention to the poor girl in the doorway with the violin. "She won't hold a candle to our students," said a man beside him, his boyish face bright with entitlements, Elias Aurelius, the conservatory's crown son. He had played on stages that tasted like ribbons and applause. He kept his hands soft and immaculate. His wrists had never felt the bite of winter. For him, music was a magnifying glass he held to his fame. He liked to be admired and also feared. "Let us see what the streets have made of her," Anton said, smiling in a way that had practice and no warmth. He did not yet know how his smile would fracture under the sound of a note. Myra stood on the gilded stage like a small altar. The orchestra parted like a sea around her. Seats thrummed. She should have been invisible, the quaint comedy the patrons discussed with their fingers on their glasses. They thought they would teach her how the civilized world worked. They thought to watch the small boat flit and be amused. Her hands were not steady. They had practice. Yes, but practice is a thing that lives in the twilight. Fingers trained to find notes in the dark, to press and release without thought. She opened the case. The violin greeted her with a sigh. Would that had been loved and neglected. The bridge had a hairline crack. The varnish had moon maps of chips. One of the strings wore a silver thread like an old seam. Myra's thumb found the place where the instrument's soul connected with its body. She felt the thread of memory in its hollow. "There's a buzz in the body," murmured Anton from the wings, like someone diagnosing a machine. "It'll sound like a kettle." "Play what you know," said the woman with the ledger face. She had the tone of someone who was about to count the cost of a joke. Myra thought of her alley again, of Elias's parting whisper, "Keep it talking." She thought of the dog's head cocking. She thought of nights when the moon had been patient and the bow had been a weapon against loneliness. She drew the bow across the string and let herself be simple. The first note did what nothing else had managed. It unstitched the air. It did not start with virtuosity. It started like a voice clearing itself in a small empty room. It was not the clear, crisp sound of refinement that Anton and his glittering audience expected. It was rough and human and caught and wound itself like a ribbon through the lungs of the hall. It was a note that remembered a cradle. It was a note that knew hunger and had lived through winter. It made one woman in the third row raise a hand to her throat as if to catch her own voice. It made a man remember a name he thought he'd forgotten. It made Elias Aurelius, who had been leaning back with a smugness that had the shape of a throne, clamp his jaw. He felt a jolt as if someone had moved the rug from under his feet. The orchestra fell away from the edges of her sound as if listening itself had been called to order. She played as if speaking the truth of something she'd been taught to keep quiet. She did not show off. She did not fill empty rooms with pretense. Her bow was an honest instrument. Her tone curved like an aching question and answered itself. For the first time in years, the conservatory's chandeliers seemed to hold their breath. Anton sat very still. His face, which had become the face of decisive capital, showed the faintest crack. Memories he had compressed into the shape of investments unfurled in the back of his skull. His father's old radio, the way a child's laughter would have sounded, a long-ago public apology he had made and then retracted. The music touched those tender places where regret had been kept on a long unpaid tab. When Myra finished the piece she had not meant to play, the audience did not erupt into the polite applause that banks out the edges of transgression. They sat, mute, and then a single, deliberate clap rose, Anton's. It sounded like a verdict. It made some people cough, as if to remember how to participate in what society called approval. Elias's hands were numb. He understood that he had been shown up not by a virtuoso's flashy runs, but by an authenticity that did not wear gloves. Afterward, there was a whirl, handshakes, offers laced with curiosity, the ledger-faced woman fluttering like a financial moth. "We could make an image of you," she said, "a piece for donors." The commoner uplifted. How very cinematic. She made the words into a commodity and held them out to Myra like a bone. Myra shrank from the language of patronage. She had nothing to trade in that currency. "I don't want your pity," she told the woman, and the words landed soft as a pastry. Anton studied her, as though inspecting a rare fabric under the light. "You have a presence," he said, and the sentence felt like an accounting ledger. Presence equals value. He meant it in financial terms, and yet something else in his voice betrayed a different reckoning. Elias watched Myra with a new sort of interest. He had spent his life being praised by people who nodded because they had to, and now he felt the itch of irrelevance. He had been trained to think of music as a ladder. Myra treated it as a language that could be spoken without permission. The conservatory could have been a chrysalis, or it could have been a cage. Anton attempted to fold her into its wings. He offered Myra a scholarship and a place in their outreach program, the sort of public relations move that added bronze to donors' names. "Think of the press," he said. "A woman from the streets rising in our halls." Myra thought of the dog's head, of the bridge, of the unwillingness to be someone else's spectacle. She hesitated. Pride sat at her shoulder, a small animal ready to bolt. Then Rosa came. Rosa was a luthier who ran a tiny shop on a crooked street where the buildings leaned like old friends. She had hands like maps and smelled of varnish and wood dust. She recognized the violin at the first glance because she had seen so many instruments that wanted to be heard. "This is a fine body," she said, lifting the instrument with a tenderness that looked like reverence. She traced its seams like a woman reading the palm of someone she loved. Rosa told Myra the violin's history in crumbs. It had once belonged to an artisan in a town by the sea, a man who made violins as other men made altars. There had been a name carved under a lining that had worn away, a small signature. The instrument had crossed hands, being given as love and then traded as necessity. Rosa worked on it like a midwife, tightening the chin rest, easing the hairline crack with gentle stitches of glue, coaxing a voice that had been sleeping. "It is not the instrument that is broken," Rosa said, "but the way people expect it to sound." Rosa herself had learned not to listen for precision so much as truth. She heard in Myra's playing something that made the wood remember how to sing. Word spread. The veneer of charity that colleges offered had an odor to it, sweet and sour, press-scented. And yet among the whispers there were strings pulled by others who saw better profit in the story than Anton did. Tabloids eager for headlines, critics who could not resist a human interest angle, and more dangerous currents, patrons who loved the idea of ownership. Elias's life, however, started to tilt toward a lesson. He had been raised to clear his throat before making an entrance and to smile with the exact amount of hunger. But when he heard Myra play again in the conservatory's practice room, not under chandeliers but in a cramped space where the plaster peeled like old sheet music, he felt something like shame. He had been prepared to be the hero of every narrative. Myra unsettled that. She made his practice greatness look like a mirror that had been carefully polished to hide its cracks. He could have let envy consume him. Instead, he found himself listening. "Why do you play like that?" he asked one afternoon, after he'd lingered longer than propriety allowed. Rain had been coaxing the city into a hush, and the conservatory smelled of dust and ink and old varnish. "Because it's the way that comes out," Myra said. Her hands were wrapped around the violin, thumb pressed like a thought against the neck. "Because my life taught me that songs were the things that kept people going when they had nothing else." Elias looked at her hands and understood that they had been taught by winter. He thought of his own hands, always manicured, always knowing which wrist would need decoration for which event. "Aren't you afraid of losing it?" he asked. "Of losing what?" Myra answered. "This? The violin? People take. People take. I learned not to rely on a person to be constant. But the thing itself, the music, that's stubborn. It'll keep." Elias was not cruel by temperament. He was brittle from a different thing, the pressure of a name. His father had invested in his destiny with a kindness that had been couched as ownership. Anton had laid down expectations like stones and expected Elias to step on them in the right order. He had meant to raise a star, and he had succeeded, a little too well at the cost of other human things. Anton, meanwhile, had not expected the storm that followed Myra to be anything other than favorable press. He arranged concerts, interviews, a segment with a television crew where he would clasp Myra's hand and look paternal and benevolent. He wanted the optics, the image of his conservatory lifting a voice from the street. It fed his philanthropy-hungry donors and secured the foundation's tax breaks. It was neat, like a ledger that closed. But when the conservatory's board wanted metrics, attendance numbers, donations, social media impressions, They found something less measurable. They found a community showing up as if to watch a miracle, not because miracles were new, but because they had recognized something true. People began to bring their own brokenness and lay it like offerings at the conservatory steps, mothers with children who had not yet found a future, old men who had been fired from factories in the same sweep as empathy, students who had been told by parents that music was not a job but a hobby. There was a tidal wave of human stories, and Anton found his neat ledger messy with the fingerprints of those who would not be counted. The tabloids wanted to paint Myra as spectacle. Critics debated whether her technique adhered to conservatory standards. Patrons whispered about the risk to the institution's reputation. But the city's people crowded into the seats as if the conservatory had become a church where music was the sacrament. Myra felt both exalted and exposed. She could not, would not, be paraded like a trophy. Yet she felt the strange clarity of being looked at with the expectation that she would perform a service, to heal, to inspire, to make others feel less alone. One night, as the hall emptied and the chandeliers cast long, in different shapes, Anton found Myra alone on the stage. Her violin case lay open like a small coffin. He had invited her to the gala's breakfast under the pretense of gratitude, but had come to seek something older. "You've been popular," he said. "Good for the conservatory. Good for the foundation. Good for me." "Do you mean good for the image or for the music?" Myra asked, and the question had a softness like folded cloth. It also held a sharpness. Anton smiled, the practiced smile that kept his income steady. "Both. You have opened doors we could not have opened ourselves." Myra's hands tightened on the instrument. "I owe you nothing." "No," Anton said. "You owe nothing in the ledger sense. But consider what opportunities exist when you're recognized. The scholarship, the teachers." He hesitated, then added, "We could offer you a real place in the conservatory. Or you could use me." Myra's voice did not raise, it simply stood still. "You can make my story into a fundraiser pylon and stick your name on it. That's what people like you are good at." There was something in Anton that did not enjoy being called out. For the first time in a long while, he felt the presence of a child within himself, the child who had been raised with as much expectation as Elias and then shoved toward prosperity, as if prosperity were a cloak that could be buttoned up to the chin. He had lived his life modifying his impulses into institutions. He had not fully understood the cost. "What did your life teach you?" he asked at last, not as a man questioning a stranger, but as a man asking his own reflection. "That music does not always need a stage," Myra said. "Sometimes it needs an audience that listens because it remembers something in itself. You bought walls to keep out disorder. You thought walls could stop things like music. You were wrong." Anton felt an ache in his chest, like something that had been kept cold for too long. He had always measured himself in balance sheets. Standing in a concert hall that seemed to suddenly have the wrong light, he found numbers inadequate. The struggle came not as one terrible revelation, but as a series of small collapses. Elias's resentment, once a smee on his jaw, softened into something more complicated: guilt. He began practicing differently, not to climb ladders but to connect. He made mistakes. He cried after a rehearsal in a way that felt like apology. He visited Rosa's shop and watched her hands ply glue and lacquer with a kind of worship. He listened to Myra play, and his own music absorbed new inflections. For him, the change was slow and stubborn. It forced him to meet cracks inside himself with ungloved hands. Anton, for his part, confronted a truth he had not allowed himself, that philanthropy could be a mask for vanity. He had used his name as bridge toll. To change that would mean dismantling a comfortable narrative. It would also mean confessing to small cruelties, privileging the right students, smoothing over the messy facts of how reputation is often purchased. He chose to risk. He did not become a saint overnight. He made public statements. He wrote checks that had stipulations he had never considered before. Funds for outreach, for instruments for children whose homes had no heat, for scholarships that were not performative. He did not do it with a grand speech. He did it with small, stubborn changes that cost him social capital. That, in the ledger of his life, was a subtraction. It made his evenings quieter and more honest. Myra, however, had her own reckonings. She had come into the conservatory with a simple idea that she would play and go back to her life. But music had a way of opening doors she had not known were closed. She taught children in outreach programs, not because it bolstered her image, but because something in her wanted to pass forward the thing that kept her small moments alive. She bristled at being called inspirational by journalists because they never wanted to know about the nights she had sat with an empty cup and a violin that bent under the cold. She wanted not to be mythologized but to be seen whole. The instrument, the one that had silenced the room with its first note, began to reveal its own story like a palimpsest. Rosa found beneath the varnish etchings, faint as breath, a sculptor's tiny mark. There was a date and a town. When she dug with gentle tools, she unearthed a name that made Myra close her eyes. Elias, not the son of Anton, but a different Elias, had been the artisan who had made the violin generation ago. The coincidence nested like a secret. Myra learned that the man who had left the violin with her had been the artisan's grandson, a man named Elias too, who had been forced to leave his town and hustle on trains to feed a family. He had pressed the violin into Myra's hands with the instruction to keep it talking because he believed the violin kept histories alive. He had been gone and untraceable, absorbed by the city's anonymous mechanisms. But through the instrument, a lineage threaded. It was in a lull between publicity and purpose that disaster, in the form of an accusation, arrived. A critic who once had favored Anton's tastes wrote a piece. Myra was a fraud. Her technique did not align with conservatory standards, and the critic implied her performance had been manipulative. He suggested her music had been engineered by publicists to tug at the heartstrings of gullible donors. Social feeds ignited. Some patrons withdrew, others doubled down. Myra could have retreated into the quiet she loved. She could have folded herself into the alley and the rain and the dog that once listened. But music had shown her that silence could be an act of violence, too, an erasure. She chose instead to play again at the conservatory's main hall, under the very chandeliers that had once glowed with the detached pleasure of privilege. This time, no one would script what she would play. Rosa repaired the violin's bridge so it wouldn't fail. Myra tuned the strings by feel and memory. When she stepped onto the stage, the hall was full of people who had returned, curious, angry, hopeful. She placed the violin under her chin and breathed. The first note did not explode as before. It was quieter, gentler, a small lamplet in a cathedral. It threaded through the audience and pulled at their throats. The critic, who had sat in the first row with his pen poised like a hunting knife, felt the old noise in his chest, a sound that made him remember his mother humming to him as a child, a memory he had sold for a column. Anton sat with his hands clasped like a man praying without belief. Elias watched with eyes that had learned humility. Myra played an ode to the city, to its ovens and its laundromats, to the laborers who pounded the pavement like percussion, to the women who tucked their children in with songs no auditor had ever recorded. The music was not virtuoso pyrotechnics. It was a series of small truths stitched together. It held a phrase that was a lullaby, a minor chord that wept like rain on a roof, a cadence that sounded suspiciously like laughter. The hall was not silent this time so much as full of the people who recognized their own misremembered tunes. When she finished, no one clapped at first. Then from the back of the hall someone began to sing softly along with a remembered phrase, and another joined, until the conservatory itself felt like a room where people had found each other's voices again. The critic put his pen down and let his face soften. He wasn't eager to write that day. He had realized the cost of words that break more than they build. There were consequences. Anton's enemies tried to call his motives into question, to insist that he had paid for the spectacle. Yet even some of his staunchest critics acknowledged that something had changed in him, maybe because he'd taken the small risk of relinquishing image control, maybe because he had begun to fund real outreach rather than mere publicity. People began to see his name in a different ledger, not as the man who polished reputations, but as someone who stepped back and let the music be itself. Elias made his own reparation. He started to teach, not to raise another child as a mirror to his name, but to pass along a curiosity that had been missing in his own upbringing. He learned to listen, to accept that sometimes the grossest talents are not the loudest. He apologized clumsily to Myra once, for the ease of his laugh when she had first entered the conservatory's gala. She accepted the apology because she had learned that forgiveness is not a currency to be spent. It's a knot to hold a community together. Myra still delivered pastries in the mornings. She still walked that same route past the market square, but now people waved at her with recognition rather than irritation. She had become a dangerous thing, visible. She had to manage offers that wanted to turn her into a brand. She learned to say no. She also learned to accept what music offered her. Students who wanted to learn, a room where people could come and play without fear of being laughed at, a small scholarship fund in Rosa's name for instruments for children. She insisted that the conservatory accept students without pedigree, that they sometimes let the community into the practice rooms and not simply into the performance halls. It was not all easy. There were nights when the critics returned with new barbs, when patrons withdrew after a scandal, when the violin failed and needed Rosa's ministrations. But for every setback, there was a note that refused to be silenced. On a late autumn afternoon, Myra visited the luthier's shop and found Rosa polishing an instrument. Light fell through the window like sun on school paper. Myra opened the violin case and took out the instrument. She lifted it and felt the wood like a friend. "You gave me this," she said. "You told me to keep it talking." Rosa smiled, her hands mapping the lines as if in prayer. "You kept it, and it has kept you." Myra thought of the alley where she'd first learned to play, of the man named Elias who had disappeared, of the city that had taught her to be wary and to be brave in equal measure. She felt the violin in her hands like a small, breathing history. It was scarred. It was imperfect. It was everything. The city changed in tiny increments. Anton wrote a letter in which he admitted to some of the conservatory's past failings and pledged funds for public programs. It made news for a short while, then the world moved on, as it always does. But the conservatory's outreach program became a fixture, and on winter mornings Myra could be seen in a practice room where light pooled like reheated honey. Children pressed their chins to newly carved rests and drew their first uncertain bows. They came with their own broken things, cracked chairs, single shoes, cold breaths, and left with melodies that no ledger could price. One evening, years after the first notes silenced the room, Myra played beneath the motorway bridge where she'd learned to listen. She played for a dog that trotted up and lay down, its head on its paws, and for a woman carrying a parcel. The city breathed its usual complicated exhale. Myra's hands were not young, but they were steady. The violin was older and wiser. A man stopped and listened, his face lined like someone who had been weight-bearing for a long time. He waited until the song finished and then, with a voice that had the roughness of many roads, he said, "You kept it talking." Myra looked up. The man set a palm on the case, like an offering. His eyes were the harbor of an unspent apology. She recognized his gait. For a second, time folded. The train whistles, the nights of hunger, the whispered instruction. The man's name tasted old and new at once. "You walked away," she said, not in accusation, but as if filling in a missing sentence. He lowered his head. "I thought I had to," he said. "I thought leaving was love. I was afraid of being the poor man who couldn't buy his daughter's bread." Myra's chest opened in a way that felt like freeing a bird. She had been holding the violin like a relic. She had been imagining the man as a phantom. Here he stood, flanked by ordinary weather, by the city's indifferent gift of rain. He sat on the curb beside her and watched the bridge's shadows move. "I heard about you," he said simply. "I am sorry. I left you with a thing that belonged to me to protect it. I didn't know what else to do." Myra set the violin between them like an altar. "You kept it talking," she echoed. There was no bitterness that could find purchase. It had been lives of survival. The man, Elias, folded like someone who had been given the chance to apologize without theater. They spoke of small things, how he had learned to pick pockets to eat, how he had worked as train staff, how his hands had learned to be clever. When he touched the violin, his fingers trembled like someone touching a wound that had healed. In the end, nothing grand happened to make the story a tidy tale. No one found a pot of gold. There were no sudden sea changes. But the violin continued to speak. It bosca and stitch and the sound of rain. It had taught people that music could be a mirror and not just a sheen. It had taught a rich man how to give space for truth rather than ads. It had taught a son what the less glamorous lessons of humility looked like. It had taught a luthier that instruments remember. Myra kept playing. She kept teaching. She kept saying no to offers that wanted to barter her life into a poster. She kept the violin's case clean, its chin rest oiled and comfortable for the neck where her head rested in the quiet of practice. Sometimes she would play for no one at all, letting the notes fall into the city like loose change. They were small payments for a world she carried inside her. And every now and then, when the city was listening, when rain made itself into a hymn, Myra would walk onto a stage and, when the lights dimmed, she would close her eyes and lay her bow to the strings. The first note, no longer a shock, no longer a scandal, would rise like an answered prayer, and the room would find its breath again.